So this family, very interesting connections, the Hitching family, more who they were connected with than the parents, but the son of this family became Sir Thomas Brooke Hitching, who was the Sheriff of London in the early 20th century. A very high-flying man who bought a castle in the Isle of Wight. He's the son of this man, so not him, but in the end he was caught out being a little bit corrupt. He had to resign a lot of his offices in the City of London. He had a sister who was very influential in education about cookery, and she ended her lives over in Vancouver in Canada. And Joseph Hitching had a niece who married the captain of the Lusitania. The Lusitania, that ship that was torpedoed off the south coast of Ireland in 1915, with a lot of deaths, including a lot of Americans. It upset the Americans very much. And the wife of that captain was born in Halifax, and she was Joseph's niece. So some connections rather than people actually buried here. Sorts of sizes and shapes of tombstones, some with rounded tops, some with pointed tops, some square. Some had little angled tops much lower, and some had the old-fashioned sort in Halifax, like the ledger stone just flat on the ground. And some of those are still coming to light under the grass when we dig occasionally. This memorial here commemorates Thomas Wadsworth. We have two men in this cemetery who conducted the Sunday school sings in the Peace Hall in the 19th century. One is buried right up at the top in rather an inaccessible place, so I don't tend to show that one very much. And this was his nephew, who was Thomas Wadsworth. The man buried up the top, he conducted most of the Peace Hall sings from the 1840s to the 1880s, but the very last one in 1890 was conducted by Thomas Wadsworth, and they'd gather thousands, about 12,000 children into the Peace Hall with their teachers. They'd have a band or an orchestra, and they'd have an adult sort of choir too. It would be a child protection nightmare and a risk assessment nightmare, wouldn't it? Very much these days. So that was the sort of thing they did down to 1890, and Mr. Wadsworth was the man who conducted the very last. The chap who conducted the earlier ones was called Abel Dean, and these were all very eminent music teachers and usually organists at churches and chapels in Halifax. To come my side or stand over there, probably a bit easy. I'm not sure how the dog is going to see though if it stands behind. I think he stands behind. Yeah. Just carefully over the stones. Ian was saying earlier how very graphic some of the descriptions on the stones are, telling you what happened, how people died. This commemorates James Edward Jacobs of Halifax, who was a murder victim, but it doesn't give you any indication he was a murder victim at all. It just says he died 1858 at the age of 34. And he worked for the Halifax Guardian newspaper, one of the two senior Halifax newspapers in the 1850s. And he was working there one day in May 1858 in the compositor's office. He put the type together. I mean, this is an old-fashioned idea, assembling type for printing in a little frame so that you could print the newspaper. He had an apprentice, and the apprentice literally went mad one day and knocked out the brains of Mr. Jacobs in his office. Not very nice at all. He was killed on the spot, and because he'd gone a bit mad, his fellow associates in the office couldn't get hold of this guy who'd gone mad. It was just simply too difficult. He was out of control, and they had to call for assistance from people in the street before the attacker was killed. And he was eventually, not that the attacker was held, I should say, not killed. So the only thing that tells us that this might be a sudden death is the scripture. Watch and pray, for you know not when the hour cometh. So that's a bit of a warning, isn't it? So that was Edward Jacobs. His killer was actually, they were compassionate to him. They decided he was mad, and so he was sent away to a special institution. He was granted that, he wasn't hanged like so many would have been. He was granted that relief, but he died a few years later in one of these kind of asylums down in the south of England. We'll go round Scarborough. Some of you may know of Scarborough Mills, just this side of King Cross, up in that direction. Demolished about 20 years ago, where more or less where Tesco, the big Tesco store, stands today. George Scarborough, who's commemorated here somewhere, he was one of the last to die. Died in 1926. He lived to be 91, which was an extraordinary age for those days. He was the last of 4 brothers who had founded those mills back in the 1880s. Their father had founded the business, and there were 4 sons who had continued it, and he was the last one to die. So that's Mr. Scarborough. And then Sheard, yes, it's right next to me. Go back, David. Mr. Sheard, he was a brewer who had Brackenbed Brewery, which you may never have heard of. If you go down Brackenbed Lane, up off Pelham Lane over there, there's a big steep lane with a bend on it. And there's a very old house which is sometimes called Little Brackenbed. I think that's what it's still called. It dates back to the 17th century. And it was a brewery building alongside there where he made his beer. What I love about Jonathan Sheard is that he was often found drunk and out of control of his vehicles, which of course were horse-drawn in those days in the 19th century. So we have a brewer. Yes. It says something. This memorial is a little bit unusual. You probably wouldn't notice it, and I'll be quite frank, we hadn't noticed it until Stuart discovered the story behind it. What it says is about Robert McMaster, who died in the 23rd year of his age. And it says was interred here. It doesn't give a date of death. And the story behind this, Stuart uncovered from an old newspaper of this sort of date. This was a young man who was backward or slow, we'd say had learning difficulties today, who wandered off from Halifax and nobody knew what had happened to him. And so when his body was finally and tragically discovered on the moors up near Skipton, nobody knew when he died. They did at least find him and identify him and bring him back to Halifax for burial. So we only have the burial date. We don't know when he died. But at least his family did know what happened to him. You can see very clearly the different levels of the cemetery. The upper level with the vaulting, and the lower. There is one, yes, there's a lovely Celtic cross that was vandalised, sadly, during the cemetery's lack of occupation. You'll find there are 1 or 2, but not many, and it's very tragic that lovely one was damaged. We haven't found the pieces either, which is a shame. So if we look down the cemetery here, the original idea was to have a bit of a promenade or a bit of a terrace here where people could walk and relax. You see, we have a seat here again after many years when there weren't any. And it was intended in Victorian times that people would come to cemeteries and walk around them rather like people do around parks. These days people have changed their attitude. The idea of having death all around you in Victorian times meant that people perhaps didn't worry so much about having lots of headstones around. I don't know. That may have had nothing to do with it. But as we look down here, we see even in the centre of that lower path, as we go towards the new information board, a lot of space where there is no stone or no memorial. And each inch of that is actually marked by a burial of some kind. Here we are standing on 2 paths either side here. They look like paths, but underneath these paths were buried a lot of infants who died, infant mortality, children who died young, sort of mass burials, rather like those for the poor, in little vaults underneath each side here. So you never know what's underneath your feet here. You just have to accept it and not look too far. Memorial that talks about the Taylor family. Some of these are also Robinsons on the other side. and the Robinsons there. These two graves are both the same family. William Robinson of Halifax, who isn't buried here but whose widow is, who died in 1864, he founded a business down in Horton Street for importing cork from Portugal. There were the cork growers called Robinson in northern and eastern Portugal, and they operated out of Halifax and out of Portugal for over 100 years, down to the 1960s. And their base was where the Halifax, well, latterly it was the Halifax First building in Horton Street that was earlier the job centre. It was the site of that building where they had their business, their warehouse in Halifax, and their offices. That was the Robinsons, the cork growers. And they married into the Hanson family. This stone here is the grave of the parents of Thomas William Hanson, I'll get it right in a minute, who wrote the old Halifax book published in 1920. His parents lie buried there, his brother and his sister. He himself was buried down in Oxfordshire, I think it was. Of stone like this. This is a very modern tombstone which formerly stood on that corner where the lilac is. It was one of those that was badly damaged probably about 30 or 40 years ago. We think a vehicle was driven at it in those days. It's sad, but we just have to accept it. The Tatum family, Joseph Tatum's wife was a naughty girl. Or was she a naughty girl? Or was she just acting according to the mind that told her what to do one day? She was unfaithful to her husband. And hers was one of the first divorce cases in Halifax after the Family Acts of 1857-1858. Her husband didn't have to go to Parliament to divorce his wife because she was unfaithful. He was able to get an ordinary divorce through the courts because that was possible by that time. All he had to do was, as you did in that time, was to prove that she'd been with a man in a certain location, and he was able to do that. Mr. Tatum then divorced his wife, who married the chap she'd been having the affair with, who was one of the Pullman family of the steel firm. You still see their lorries around here. The second husband is buried over in the area in the section over there. So it's a very early divorce case, 1859 in Halifax, Joseph Tatum and his wife. Beautifully carved, but unfortunately rather weathered, a carving of Jesus receiving the children, and it says round, "Suffer little children to come to me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of God," from Luke's Gospel. This was a memorial to a little boy who died at about the age of 10. His father was a stonemason, and the stonemason family were called Cordingley. They all came from North Howram. The great big pinnacle you see just this side of the chapel, that's the memorial to the stonemason and keeper of this chapel, whose name was Simeon Cordingley. This is the son of his brother, a little boy, and is a sort of soapstone, we think, and originally it had some kind of glazing which would have protected it from the weather, but sadly that has gone, and we're not convinced it would necessarily be a good idea to replace it. But it's an interesting style which doesn't appear anywhere else in the cemetery, of a soft stone incorporated into a hard stone. So Gad Cordingley, these are interesting names from Genesis, Gad and Simeon, these two brothers. He eventually died, did Gad. Talks about him here. He died in 1878, and then his widow lived to be 92, and finally the little boy's sister, Leah, died in 1956 at the age of 93. So we have a little boy who died back in 1869. His sister died as recently as 1956. Renewed because it got a bit vandalised, and that does still happen. Commemorates the Building Society, Halifax Building Society founders and early operatives in this town. A number of whom are buried in this cemetery. I mentioned one of them down there, Mr. McVine, but the most significant is a chap who's commemorated here, Jonas Durnley Taylor, who was the secretary of the early Halifax Permanent Building Society from when it was founded right down to his death, nearly 50 years later. It was before the Permanent became a huge society. It became a very big society, but it really developed much more after his death. So he's mentioned here, along with many others who are commemorated in the cemetery, and we have locations where they're buried. The information board across there commemorates the Crossleys and some of their connections in this cemetery in a bit more detail. The memorial to Harriet Dell, who was our founder, in the corner over there. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed your tour. Stuart somewhere over there may have a donations pot, I don't know quite where. Oh, it's by the door, thank you. If you feel like putting a few pence in, if you feel you have an interest in the cemetery and would like to support us as members of the Friends, please fill in your form and return it to us. If you would like to get involved with helping us with any gardening aspect, likewise, please get in touch with us. Thank you for being such an excellent audience and being patient with me and not stumbling over lots and lots of obstacles, and you survived for another day. You've passed your test. Thank you.
Thank you.